All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our noon briefing. Policy and ethics shape the future of human embryo research. We have two speakers on our briefing today. They're Kirstin Matthews, a fellow in science and technology policy at Rice University, and Anna Iltis, the Carlson Professor of the University Studies and Philosophy at Wake Forest University, and the Director of the Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society, also at Wake Forest. We will hear a little bit from both of our speakers, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kirstin Matthews. My research focuses on emerging biotechnology and ethical and policy challenges they face. I am a fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. What I'd like to talk to you today about is policy challenges related to human embryo research. Over the past few years, research to understand early human development has exploded. Scientists have been able to culture and grow human embryos beyond 14 days, which is the traditional limit placed on this work. Researchers have been manipulating stem cells, specifically or especially embryonic stem cells and induced pluripotent stem cells, to create entities which mimic different developmental stages of the early embryo. I'm going to call these embryoids, but they go by various other names, including synthetic embryos, artificial embryos, and various acronyms. Finally, we saw in 2018 Chinese scientists manipulate human embryos for reproductive purposes. In the U.S., we have no official policy on human embryo research. Scientists do follow the 14-day rule. The 14-day rule limits human embryo research to 14 days after to research before 14 days after fertilization or the formation of the primitive streak, which is an observable reorganization of cells. The U.S. does ban federal funding for human embryo research through the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. The amendment is not permanent, but places a limit on or a ban on annual funding going through the annual appropriation bills. While it limits federal funding, it places no limit on human embryo research conducted with private funds. Therefore, there's no official U.S. policy which captures both the public and the private spheres. It is also unclear if and how this amendment impacts embryoid research, or embryos created with this research. Most scientists would say no, because the current models all have missing components, making them unable to develop fully. But will there ever be human enough, or these entities, embryoids, human enough to be considered an embryo? How should funding agencies in the U.S. approach these entities? Should they be funded or banned, considering the Dickey-Wicker Amendment? These issues are currently unresolved at the National Institutes of Health. NIH has sent really unclear guidance to scientists. They only indicate that they will access or assess each grant on a case-by-case basis, whether or not it's funded and whether or not they think it's appropriate. We also have a second amendment with appropriation bills that prohibits the FDA from acknowledging or even reviewing proposals to manipulate genes in a human embryo. So this bans experiments like the one that was conducted in China. But again, it's not permanent. It's actually passed on an annual basis. In most other countries with significant research and development funding, there are specific laws and policies that regulate human embryo research. A lot of countries do have a 14-day rule or something similar, like the UK, Australia, but this is not uniform. Some countries actually ban it that have Austria, Russia, Italy, for instance, have a ban on human embryo research, and others have limits. Switzerland's well known for having a limit of 7 days instead of 14. However, it's unclear these existing policies and how they apply to embryoid research, and the regulation on heritable modifications of embryos is also unclear. Overall policies that affect human embryo, embryonic stem cells, embryoid, and heritable genetic modifications can no longer be really a one-size-fits-all policy. Each area should be considered on its own based on risks, benefits, and consequences to society. Further, like human embryo and embryonic stem cell policies, we are unlikely to really see a true compromise where everyone has the same policy. However, overarching principles that scientists help work with stakeholders, to determine what is acceptable and not acceptable are needed to guide policies and limit bad actors. With that, I was going to have Dr. Iltis talk about the ethical challenges associated.
Thank you. I'm Anna Iltis from Wake Forest University. As Dr. Matthews said, it recently became technically possible to grow embryos in vitro beyond 14 days after fertilization. This was not possible at the time that the 14-day limit was proposed and widely accepted. Now that the technical barrier to research beyond 14 days has been lifted, scientists and scholars, or some scientists and scholars, have argued that it's time to lift the rule that restricts research on embryos beyond 14 days. As a reminder, in the United States, there is no legal prohibition on doing research on embryos beyond 14 days. Such research may not be funded using federal money, and scientific guidelines that many scientists voluntarily follow restrict research to 14 days, but there is no prohibition on such research in the United States. The desire among some to do research on embryos beyond 14 days that will result in their destruction has led to renewed discussion about the moral status of the human embryo. That is, what respect, and if any, we owe to them, and what kinds of practices are consistent with or violate that respect. Nothing that we have learned about the human embryo from the time that the 14-day limit was developed suggests that they are different from what we once thought. In other words, nothing we have learned about embryos tells us that we relied on misinformation about what embryos are like when adopting the 14-day limit. There is nothing that we've learned that says about their status or about their capacities that tells us or gives us reason to think that it used to be wrong to destroy them after 14 days, but now it's not. Proponents of lifting the 14-day limit often seem to be arguing that scientists could do so much good by learning more about embryo development that the rules should be lifted. In other words, they argue that scientists should be able to study embryos beyond 14 days because of the good that could come from doing so. Such arguments will not motivate those who hold that destroying embryos in research involves destroying early human life, and that this is wrong. There are many things that we could do that might result in some overall good, but that are not permitted because they involve wrongdoing, and this is no different from the point of view of people who oppose embryo destruction in research. I want to underscore that proponents of embryo research did not object to the 14-day limit until it became a real limit. When it was not technically possible to breach the limit, the 14-day rule seemed like a great idea. It was widely acceptable to proponents of embryo research. The desire to change the rule now that the technical limit no longer exists runs a very real risk of undermining public trust in the capacity and willingness of scientists to accept any limitations on research for ethical reasons. Up to now, much of the concern with embryo research has been that it results in their destruction. For people who recognize the embryo as early human life, that can be deeply problematic. They object to the research because they object to destroying embryos, which is what most embryo research thus far has involved. Today, however, we face a new set of questions regarding what may be done to human embryos. In light of the interest in editing human embryos and ultimately bringing them to birth, it's plausible that some human embryo research will not result in the destruction of embryos, but instead eventually will lead to the transfer of embryos for gestation. In other words, some embryo research might lead to live births. Some, of course, already has. At that point, as we saw following the 2018 announcement in China, we face numerous questions, not about whether it's permissible to destroy embryos, but about whether it's permissible to manipulate embryos and then allow them to be born. Much has been said about the ethical issues raised by the case of initially 2 and now 3 live births in China subsequent to human germline editing. I don't think I need to repeat all of that. While discussions of past behavior are important, and we no doubt can learn much from examining the particular case in China, there is much to consider about the future. It seems to me that many people believe that heritable germline modification in the future is inevitable. Whether that's the case remains to be seen, but it is reasonable to think that we are headed in that direction. In light of that, it is ever more important not to put our blinders on and instead to think in very concrete terms about the conditions under which it might be responsible to pursue this work. This includes questions about when it's safe enough to try and what kinds of conditions should be the subject of germline genome editing research, and what kind of oversight would be necessary for such work. Finally, the world of embryoid research currently is wide open space. There are no substantive ethical guidelines or regulations governing that research. I expect that we will continue to see disagreements about how that research should be conducted, whether it should be overseen at all, and to what kinds of regulations it should be subject. Answering those questions likely will require coming to grips first with how we understand what embryoids are. And that's likely to change as the research progresses and the characteristics and capacities of those structures change. Finally, even though many of the questions facing the future of embryo research and embryoid research are new, they're really in some ways old questions and challenges. They involve questions about how to craft public policy on contentious ethical issues in a morally pluralistic society. We don't, and I don't think we ever will, have consensus on these matters.
Thanks so much. We'll open it up to your questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic and kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. Okay, question in the back.
Hi, my name is Gadi Ben Yehuda. I'm with AAAS. I'm interested actually in the very last thing that you said, if we can kind of take that a step further. So you said you don't think that we can ever reach consensus on these matters. So living in that pluralistic society, what is the best way to determine if we should keep the regulations the way they are, or if we should change them if it is not by reaching consensus? Thank you.
Sure. So I think it's obviously a huge question because it's a huge topic, but I think there's a few things that are important to kind of set the stage for that. For dealing with contentious public policy issues in a morally pluralistic society. One of them is separating out questions of what is permissible from what is federally funded. So we often conflate those in talking about science. We think that if it's not federally funded, then it's not allowed, and that's not true. There's a lot of research that is permissible, in the sense of legally permissible, that is not federally funded, and I think that's an important distinction to make in thinking about highly controversial topics. The second is to think about issues of transparency and clarity about what is allowed, who's doing it, what is being done, and being honest. I often hear people talk about the consensus on the 14-day rule as if there is consensus that it's permissible to destroy embryos up to 14 days. That's simply not the case. So we often invoke consensus in discussions because I think it makes us feel justified in doing whatever we're doing. But I think being honest about the fact that there is not consensus, and instead of trying to pretend that there is, recognizing that there's not. And that sometimes requires honesty that's uncomfortable. And so the fourth piece of this is actually trying to forge compromises where possible. So sometimes it is possible to compromise. And true compromise involves all parties giving up something. And the 14-day rule has often been characterized as a compromise. I've often insisted that it is not a compromise because proponents of embryo research gave up nothing in accepting the 14-day limit, right? You couldn't get anywhere close to 14 days. And so it was not a limit. And so I think those are sort of a few important pieces.
I'm going to add a little bit to that, which is that we currently in the U.S. do not actually have a required mandate for oversight of human embryo research. It's kind of this weird gap of space. There is stem cell research that you have a committee that could have a review, which has been proposed by several international organizations, and they propose expanding it out and to include human embryo research, but it's not necessarily required. And I think in these places, these spots of these emerging technologies where we have conflict and it really needs more of a transparency where they will go through this process, because in theory, some of this research could have gone without any external review. And I think that's actually what really truly makes everyone uncomfortable, is having no oversight whatsoever. It's not an IRB because it's not a human subject. It's an embryo, not an embryonic stem cell, so it doesn't count as a stem cell oversight committee. It fills in this little gap. The person who did the research in 2016 forced the stem cell committee to review it. They were a little uncomfortable, but he made them do it anyway because he wanted the approval and he wanted to show that he was thinking about it thoughtfully. And embryoid, these embryos themselves, even the germline modification, I think all of this showed a space where there was actually a lack of oversight. And some of that space just doesn't exist. And I think having an oversight, you will never get a perfect consensus, but you will actually have a little bit more of a public acceptance that you're doing things respectful.
Or confidence in the system. I think breeding trust and confidence in science is important. And it's important not only for society, but it's important for scientists. So thinking about the structures that do that is really vital.
Question in the front?
Ben Upton. Is it on? Does it matter?
It should be on. Yeah.
Okay, Ben Upton, Research Professional News. Do we need to legally regulate embryoid research before public attention arrives on the field? Because you said that there's not much attention yet. Should we be doing this kind of preemptively before there's a pushback, or?
I think we got a huge pushback from the 2018 announcement, which is also resulting in everyone trying to decide what you want and don't want to do. And I think if scientists want to figure out what space is acceptable, and I think they are interested in it might not be a legal one, but there might be also a self-regulation that they put into place, right? The Stem Cell Oversight Committee isn't always a legal thing, but it's also part of, journals accept it and require it oversight. Several journals have having that kind of oversight that is self-regulatory that the system kind of builds itself on is going to help prevent, I think, a more public outcry.
Well, and I think with respect to the embryoids, were you asking about embryoids also?
Yeah, it
So-
doesn't have to be just that.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges with the embryoid research is that because right now it falls into an unclear place, and because precisely what these entities are is unclear and ever changing, it would be wise, whether it's a legal structure or not, that gets more complicated, at least in the US, but certainly oversight systems and guidelines would be appropriate to begin to develop those, because the point at which that research advances to the point that people are looking at it and thinking, no, these really are more like embryos than anything else, you don't want to be caught off guard at that point. And I think it would be very wise to have systems in place now or start developing those systems to ensure that at the point at which that research crosses a certain threshold, that it really does look like something much more like embryo research than like anything else, that we're prepared. And I think the same thing applies to the sort of CRISPR-Cas9 situations. The idea of being the world was sort of caught off guard in some sense in 2018, and that's not a good place to find science.
Two questions about embryoids. One, what kind of resources and facilities do you need to make them? Is it relatively easy to do at many research labs? And then also that question, will they ever be human enough? How will you go about thinking about how to answer that and get consensus and answers to that?
I'll go with the first one, which is the embryoid question. I haven't created any. I know of some people who have. I haven't watched the process, but it is not the same level as what we discussed CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR-Cas9, while I also haven't done it, I was trained with a PhD in biology. So I think if I embedded myself for a month, maybe I could probably figure this out. Embryoids, I think it would take a lot longer because I think putting them in, it's working with your embryonic stem cells, so learning how to work with the tissue and working with those cells, and then you have to start organizing them and differentiating them in a specific fashion and manner, and there's a little bit of art that's involved with tissue culture. So this isn't something where you're just going to see some random person who's not trained in any biology just jump into it. It's going to come from a lab where they learn everything together.
The threshold question, sort of, who are you? And I think it's very interesting to me right now that we're exploring these questions on the embryoid side. What are these entities? Are they sort of human? Are they human-like? Could they ever become human? At the same time that we're having these discussions in the AI world about, well, to what extent are these various forms of AI doing human-like things? What do we owe them? I think it's really interesting. It will be very interesting to watch society kind of explore these two kind of threshold questions, identity questions at the same time. And this takes us back to really fundamental questions in philosophy. What does it mean to be human? And it's for me, it's an exciting place as a philosopher where sort of philosophy and science really come together. They're not just scientific questions. There certainly are really important scientific questions about what the structure is, what it can do, what it cannot do, but it's not just about what's in the dish.
Question here.
After the case,
May I have your name and affiliation?
Oh yeah, I'm Pratik. I'm a journalist from India. After the 2018 case in China, there was a call for a global moratorium on these kinds of issues. So, can you update me on these issues? And if that's the case, is it even possible to have a global consensus?
So that's an interesting question, and whether or not they have a moratorium. Some people suggested a moratorium. Other ones were suggesting, and I know originally when there's a group coming together that involves the U.S. National Academies, the Royal Society, and then they brought in other national academies together to kind of review this question about heritable genome editing, as well as the World Health Organization has a committee also trying to assess it. The moratorium, I think, came from a paper article with a set of people who came out and said that we should have it. There was also calls for it prior to the 2017 recommendations from the U.S. National Academies to have a moratorium as well, but that's not what they ended up suggesting. They suggested some guidelines instead. It's kind of questionable, too, overall, since no authority has said that we should have one, if it's truly happened, and because we were so thrown off guard by the individual in China doing it, whether or not there is somebody else who's actually doing this technique and it's not known yet and they haven't been public about it, is also something I think people are worried about.
It's a great example of the attempts of science to self-regulate and the extent to which self-regulation works and the extent to which self-regulation has its limits. So you can say, if you want to be a part of the community of responsible scientists, these are the guidelines you should follow, or you should not be doing this research right now in the case of a moratorium. Whether that's enforceable in any way is very difficult for me to understand. I don't think it's enforceable. And many have suggested that a moratorium is actually not a smart answer, because what we should be doing is sort of figuring out under what conditions should this research be done, what should the research look like, not, everybody stop. But it's an example of, right now, of totally of self-regulation in the scientific community. There's no universal lawgiver that tells us, thou shalt not do this anywhere in any place in the universe.
Maybe a slightly more granular scientific question. The Switzerland, you said, follows the 7-day rule, and we follow the 14. What do we gain with those additional 7 days? What are we learning between days 8 and 14 that, maybe they aren't getting to understand in Switzerland?
So I want to point out something that's a little interesting about the 7-day rule that they did there. So they made these rules that allowed for a little bit of embryo research, but I think it was mostly directed to allow embryonic stem cell research, because at day 5 is usually when they pull the embryo to create embryonic stem cells. What's also interesting is the way they did it. Embryoid research is actually perfectly fine with it, because it allows for everything to happen there, so you can have that on a longer time span, where some countries, the way they wrote it, for instance, Australia wrote their rules with a 14-day rule, but they were so worried about reproductive cloning that they actually banned embryoid research because of the way they defined everything in the embryo in that particular model of their policy. I'm not sure if that's what they intended to, and I think the scientists and some of the policy scholars are kind of trying to push to see if they can change the legislation to open up the research. So there's unintended consequences of when you're trying to fix something and not something else. When we talk to the scientists about what we're learning from the first 14 days, we're just starting to kind of unearth and really understand what's going on. They did this huge leap, and it was really exciting. There's a lot of work I think they're going to be able to do, and it points towards some infertility, implantation, the beginning of this gastrulation, which is starting to form really primitively organizing, maybe organs. But all that knowledge, I think, is really what we think that scientists should be digging into right now, probably a little bit more before pushing on for kind of later time points.
There's a lot of open data now. Are you all at all concerned about human embryo research on preprints, something getting ahead of everybody else and people looking at it and causing concern among scientists or even the public?
I'm worried more about competition, and this is what we noticed with Dr. He in China, is that he was so eager to be first, he didn't stop to think if he should be doing it. I'm more worried not about being open and everyone sharing, and I think there's a lot of things to say that's positive about sharing your data. I'm more worried that everyone is going to feel so competitive to be first, to be out there. The papers that came out actually came out simultaneously with 2 different labs working on human embryos. which I think is kind of interesting, in which I know that they probably talk with each other, and I like the fact that they came out at the same time. So you can be collaborative, you don't have to be first, and you should also kind of take a pause and realize, is being first really the best thing? He is now first, and unfortunately, he is now found guilty of illegal practice of medicine in China, and looks like he's going to go for prison for a little bit of time as well.
Another question in the front.
We scientists often call for kind of debates, public debates. What's the best way of actually having a public debate, not just saying, you've had a chance to talk about this? I mean, there've been exercises in Ireland and the UK in what people call a deliberative democracy, where you have these random sample of citizens and get them to hammer it out. Would you like to see something like that in the US around these issues, or is there a better way even than that?
I mean, I think truly informed public engagement and public deliberation of that sort, and I think the UK has really good examples, even in the history of human embryo research, of doing that, of really engaging the public. I think one of the challenges with doing that is truly being open to diverse points of view. So one of the criticisms of many of the attempts at sort of public engagement that have occurred in the US around certain topics is that in the end, it seems that not everybody was truly welcome at the table, and there was not necessarily truly a desire to incorporate minority voices. And to do this in a way that is honest and transparent, it does require hearing from people with whom we may disagree and whose conclusions we may not like. And sometimes those voices may point us to things that we were truly ignorant of and that are of vital importance. So I think there's a lot to be said for genuine, open public engagement. And that does have to involve also at times providing education to the public of various sorts. So an informed public, not just sort of, what do you think? I think embryoids is a great example of a place where if you used that word and you said it and you said, well, what do you think? Let's talk about this. How could people have anything like a meaningful conversation? People need information and need education. But then from there's much to be gained from understanding what a diverse landscape looks like.
I want to follow up with that, which is I work in a think tank. One of the aspects we do is public diplomacy. They talk about a lot. My director was a former ambassador, and the first tenement of public diplomacy is to listen. And that's actually what I tell most scientists when we talk about this idea of stakeholder engagement and public dialogues is, okay, but first you have to remember you have to listen. It's not an idea where you're going to explain what everything is going on to the public and then have them accept it at the end. You have to listen to the concern and integrate them.
Tom Keenan, Business Edge from Canada. There's certainly people, to your comment about what is human, there are certainly people who would extend human-like treatment to primates and so on. Are there restrictions on primate embryo research?
Not that I'm aware of.
Well, there's a lot of restrictions on primate research.
So
but that would fit in with animal research as well.
So the things that would be required to get oocytes, for example, from a primate, there would be restrictions. Whether there are restrictions specifically on the embryos of those primates, I do not know.
Most of the models they've been playing around with actually is mouse. I think they're just hard to obtain.
Very expensive.
And expensive. So you're using our early development background that we know comes from obviously other animal organisms, and the ones that they suggested go to chick. They're mouse a little bit, but obviously they don't look like us because we don't all end up in the same organism at the end. And if you're at our panel, we were looking through even at day 14, they look distinctly different, a mouse and a human embryo, how the cells, even though they're barely organized, they're already starting to organize a little differently.
I think the honest answer is I don't know. And I've not heard anybody talking about it, which suggests that it's not a significant part of the work that's going on in this area. And I think just from what I know about primate research, as a practical matter, it would be unlikely that that would be the first place to go because of the costs and the issues that are associated with doing research on the living primates from whom you'd have to get oocytes.
Is there any research being done in human embryos that you'd think we'd be surprised to know about? You know, fertility is something you mentioned, that's something we might imagine. Are there other research questions being explored in embryos that are kind of beyond that?
I guess this is when we should have brought in our.
Well, I think part of it is that we simply much of what's going on we don't know, right? We don't always know what's happening until it's reported. I think there's probably a lot that people don't realize can be learned or is being learned from embryo research, but I don't have any examples of anything that I think people would find particularly shocking.
Okay. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much to both of our speakers. That was great. Appreciate your time. Thank you.